What's going on, you guys? Welcome back to the SFS channel. My name's Gavin, and today I've got my favorite episode of the week for you guys. It's my Fantasy Football Week 8 Trade Targets video, where I let you guys in on my buy low and sell high candidates for NFL fantasy football action moving forward this season. Before I get into today's episode, each and every one of you guys needs to go down and hit the subscribe button to my channel and turn the bell on so you guys are notified every time I come out with a new episode. You guys have been awesome recently. The amount of support for the channel has been great, and I'm super thankful for all the interaction I've had with you guys over the last couple of weeks. But we need to keep that subscriber count going up. We need to keep growing this community so that I can get to a point where I can do some really cool giveaways and stuff for you guys, where I can give away my draft guide for next year's fantasy football action, and I can do some jersey giveaways and whatnot as well. So if you guys are interested in that, make sure to subscribe, stick around to the channel, and let's win some fantasy football games together. With that being said, I've done enough talking. Let's hit the intro and get into the football. Alright, we're going to start this video off with my buy low candidates, and my first guy on the board is the Seahawks star wide receiver DK Metcalf, who just came off a very underwhelming performance on Sunday Night Football, where he faced shadow coverage from Patrick Peterson, who really did a number on DK Metcalf. Metcalf was held to just 2 receptions for 23 yards, and I think that some fantasy owners might begin to start panicking on DK Metcalf, especially since he just had a bye week last week and they were not able to experience the luxury of his numbers in their lineup. I think the most alarming thing for fantasy owners when they look at DK Metcalf's stat line is the lack of volume that he receives on that team. DK Metcalf, though, is more of a big play, deep down the field threat. He had 4 straight games to open up the season where he only had 4 receptions, and then after that he had a 6-catch game, and then he moved into the bye week and then followed that up with a 2-catch performance on Sunday Night Football. So DK Metcalf, definitely not a high-volume wide receiver, but he is still an elite fantasy football player and talent in the league. If you guys are owners of DK Metcalf, do not sell him. Hang on to DK Metcalf. He's a very good asset. He's going to put up really nice numbers the rest of the season, but nobody can have that elite production every single week of a fantasy season. I think another thing that might be scaring off some fantasy owners is that Tyler Lockett was so involved last week, but people don't realize Tyler Lockett came off 2 down games as well, and then he had that enormous output where he had 200 yards, 15 catches, and 3 touchdowns, I believe. So everyone has those incredible boom weeks if they're a star in fantasy, and it's inevitable that at some point they're going to have some bust performances as well. DK Metcalf doesn't even need that many catches to have a really great game. Obviously, we've seen throughout those 4-catch performances, he was very productive as well. So DK Metcalf is definitely a guy who can get it done for you, and I wouldn't panic at all. I'd buy low if you had the chance and hang on to him if he's already on your roster. My next buy low candidate up on the board is Chase Claypool, the Steelers rookie wide receiver who just broke out a few games ago. He's been on an absolute tear, and his touchdown count has been through the roof. He's been very productive and almost a Swiss Army knife for that Steelers offense. He's been taking handoffs in little jet sweeps, as well as some really nice screen passes where he's shown the ability to make run after catch, and he's also had contested down the field plays as well. So Chase Claypool has shown that he can do it all at the next level. He's a guy that I am very comfortable with in starting lineups the rest of the season, but that 1-catch, negative 2-yard performance against the somewhat shaky Titans secondary, I think, has a lot of people worried about his value moving forward this season. Sunday afternoon, plain and simple, was just a Deontay Johnson game. The Steelers were feeding him the ball. He was unable to be guarded by anybody in that game. He was getting open left and right, and Deontay Johnson was the guy to go to for the Steelers, along with that ground game and JuJu Smith-Schuster sprinkled in there as well. So I think that after all of those crazy performances from Claypool, JuJu kind of disappeared from the offense, so they shifted their coverage more towards Claypool, who was the predominant wide receiving threat in that offense. And then I think that when they shifted the coverage his way, it actually opened up things for JuJu Smith-Schuster, and then Deontay Johnson got back in the mix after dealing with some injuries. So Chase Claypool is not a guy I'm worried about at all. They're not going to be able to bracket any of the receivers in that offense because there's so many weapons there. Ben Roethlisberger is a great quarterback to have distributing the ball to you. So obviously Big Ben is going to get Chase Claypool the football. I think that he's a very unique weapon in that offense and a guy that Big Ben has really never had in his career before. Just like with DK Metcalf, if you're a Chase Claypool owner, I am saying hold on Chase Claypool. Do not trade him. If you're able to capitalize on someone who's looking to sell him because they're concerned about his play, because he just put up negative yardage this week, absolutely do so if the trade is at the right price. Obviously, you don't want to give up too much for him, but Chase Claypool for me is a high-level wide receiver 2 producer. I would say his floor is really safe as well. I think his floor is a mid wide receiver 2 level producer. So I think that Chase Claypool has a nice ceiling and floor. Obviously, we've seen him put up those game-winning wide receiver 1 type numbers, but you can't expect that on a week-to-week basis from a rookie wide receiver. So for me, Chase Claypool is still a starting wide receiver moving forward. You just can't expect a rookie wide receiver to put up numbers like a Calvin Ridley per se, who is the number 2 in another fantastic offense, but has 3 years of experience under his belt. My next buy low candidate is Aaron Jones, who I actually talked about in my Week 7 trade video. Aaron Jones saw his snap count decrease against the Falcons, and then after that they moved into the bye week, followed up by a ugly performance against Tampa where he was kind of bailed out by a touchdown. And then last week against Houston, he didn't even see the field because he injured his calf at practice and was unable to suit up for the game. If fantasy owners were beginning to sweat when Aaron Jones started to see that decline over the last 3 weeks or so, they are definitely panicking now. Aaron Jones looks to be trending downwards, but I'm here to tell you that he is going to be just fine, and he is a top 3 fantasy football player in the fantasy playoffs this season. During the 3 weeks of the traditional fantasy playoffs, the Packers have a very light schedule, and I see Aaron Jones as a top 3 running back in fantasy football down the stretch, just behind Christian McCaffrey and Alvin Kamara. If you have the opportunity to go trade for Aaron Jones in your fantasy league, you need to do so. Those type of guys are the guys that win fantasy football championships. They're the guys that week in and week out provide a safe and consistent floor for your fantasy lineups, along with that elite level upside that can win you each and every week. The value of guys with the volume and efficiency at that position is invaluable, and you can't get enough of those guys in your fantasy lineups. If you guys have any opportunity to acquire any of those guys in your team, obviously go do it. But right now, Aaron Jones' stock is down just a little bit, so if you guys are able to take advantage of that and get him on your team, absolutely do so. He may sit out another week this week. He wanted to play last week, but Matt LaFleur, the Packers head coach, actually said that they were not going to consider playing him until he was at 100% health. So until Aaron Jones is 100% ready to hit the field running again, he will not see any action. So if you can afford to give up another week of not having that production in your lineup, absolutely go trade for him. This might be a tougher ask for a team that needs every win right now and they're already in playoff mode, but for teams that are sitting at the top of their leagues and can afford to give up some assets and fall down the seeding a little bit, go get Aaron Jones and he'll pay back all of those lost games for you. Aaron Jones is going to be a guy who's very, very vital to championship teams in fantasy this year, and I think that he is going to be the guy that can pull a lot of teams over the edge this season. I talked about Miles Sanders as well in last week's trade video, but Miles Sanders is another one of those guys who is a mid to high level RB1 when he's on the field, dealing with some nagging injuries right now, nothing serious, thankfully for Sanders, but he's a guy who, when he's on the field, has elite explosion. Miles Sanders had 2 weeks in a row with 70-plus yard carries. One was a touchdown. They actually both resulted in touchdowns, but one he actually fumbled, and his teammate picked up in the end zone for the score. So Miles Sanders has been phenomenal when he's been on the field this season. He's been a very, very solid RB1, very dependable player. If you guys, same thing as Aaron Jones, can afford to give up a little bit of your starting lineup to go get him and potentially miss out on another week of action for him, it's not a guarantee that he's going to sit just like Aaron Jones this week. He might suit up this week, but Miles Sanders, definitely a guy who is worth the risk and investment because he's a guy who can set you over the edge in the fantasy playoffs. With this next buy low candidate, you guys are probably starting to see a trend develop here. My buy low candidates tend to be guys who had down performances the past week or a couple weeks, and they're guys who I think have tremendous upside, along with guys who are dealing with minor nagging injuries, who are held out of contests, but ultimately, if you guys can afford the sacrifice and the risk of putting up a couple weeks in jeopardy for the greater good and ultimate long-run success that you'll see in the playoffs if they return healthy, those are the guys that I think have the highest upside in trades and are the easiest to get off of opposing squads, because obviously top-level producers are almost impossible to trade for in fantasy football, so you got to try and find that sweet spot where you can mix minimal risk with high reward, and Chris Carson is the next guy up on the list that I think fits the mold. Chris Carson, since the beginning of last year, has the most 20-touch performances of any running back in the NFL. Chris Carson has been an absolute workhorse for the Seahawks, and obviously being involved in that offense with Russell Wilson is a huge plus for his fantasy value. along with all those touches, he gets a lot of scoring opportunities. Chris Carson gets a lot of freebie gimme 1-yard touchdowns on the goal line, so that really helps his value as well. And Chris Carson has really developed as a receiving threat over the past few seasons. Right now, he's currently dealing with an ankle injury, and I think that Chris Carson is expected to miss a week or two. Nothing significant, and obviously for a guy who's been dinged up here and there throughout the season, it's mildly concerning, but I think that Chris Carson will come back strong from this injury, and he's not going to miss significant time here. So I think that the investment in Chris Carson is worth it, and he is a borderline RB1, so if you can pair him with another elite level RB1 like a Kamara, a Christian McCaffrey when he comes back in week 9 is what is expected. If you can pair him with an Aaron Jones, a Miles Sanders, any of those guys that I've been talking about on the channel here for the last couple months, do so, and it will pay off big time for your team. This next guy here on my buy low list is definitely my most polarizing player on the list that I've probably had all season long, to be quite honest. Ezekiel Elliott is a guy who people are all over the spectrum on. And I think that Ezekiel Elliott, in the midst of the disaster that is the Dallas Cowboys offense, is actually the lone bright spot for that team and has the potential to totally flip the script for that offense. Right now, if I were to ask you what are the 2 biggest deficiencies for the Dallas Cowboys, you would say defense in general. Team defense for the Cowboys has been atrocious. They haven't been able to stop anybody, and they are on pace right now to give up the most points, yards, and scores, I believe, of any team in NFL history. So, and then the other thing would be quarterback play. They're on to their 3rd-string quarterback. Dak Prescott obviously sent that team in a downhill spiral when he got injured, and then Andy Dalton came in and got that concussion last week. So, with that being said, how can the Cowboys fix their team's woes? And the answer to that is Ezekiel Elliott. Quarterback play has been a huge issue for the Cowboys. So how do you fix that? You turn around and hand the ball off to Zeke 25 to 28 times a game. Dallas's team defense has been atrocious. So how do you keep them off the field? You sustain drives with long, grindy Ezekiel Elliott pound the rock plays over and over and over again. Zeke has the potential to honestly carry this team to the division title. If he can stop coughing up the football, this team will be a lot more efficient, and the turnover differential will be a lot more in favor of the Dallas Cowboys, and this team actually has a shot to be somewhat competitive again. If Zeke gets the chance to carry the rock at those ridiculous RB1 numbers again, I think that Zeke could be putting up the numbers that we saw from him in his first 2 seasons in the NFL when he was just this absolute game-changing running back, this freak of nature that was unheard of before. And I think that Feed Zeke could be a real game changer down the stretch of this season. Now, that's a lot of stuff. That's a lot of what ifs. That's a lot of projections that I think are somewhat unrealistic. Obviously, on paper, that sounds fantastic. But even if that doesn't happen, here's what Zeke has going in his favor despite all of the issues with the Dallas offense. Ezekiel Elliott is the number 2 running back in the NFL in terms of average targets per game, in terms of the receiving game. So that means Ezekiel Elliott is behind only Alvin Kamara himself in terms of how many targets he gets out of the backfield per game. This is a stat that you typically don't associate Ezekiel Elliott with, as he's more thought of as a standard play in fantasy football, and more of a guy who's going to get you that 20-25 carries per game. And he's just going to hammer the football and not really be used as a receiving threat. But since Dallas has been trailing in so many games, they've been checking it down to Elliott, and he's been doing work in the passing game as well this year. Zeke's inability to hang on to the football and the issues he's having with fumbles this season, along with the fact that he's not getting those workhorse carries because Dallas is constantly trailing, is causing fantasy owners to think less of him this season. But Ezekiel Elliott needs to be thought of in that high RB tier still. I think that he's a guy who really could be a top 5 running back finisher this season. I think he's got the potential to completely flip the script of this season and turn things around. So Zeke's a guy I'd be patient with here. If you've got Zeke on your team, pretty much for all these buy low players, basically what I'm saying is if they're already on your team, you need to hang on to them. And if you are looking for an asset that can change your fantasy season, I think that Zeke is especially a guy whose value is really down right now, and you have the chance to capitalize and make a huge move for your fantasy team. This next buy low candidate is definitely a standard play only for me. I'm kind of over Josh Jacobs in PPR formats. I think that he definitely has the rushing volume, but the receiving game is just not there for Josh Jacobs. When he came into the league, I was really hoping that he would be that next Ezekiel Elliott clone, get those 20 to 25 touches per game behind that elite Raiders offensive line, but Josh Jacobs just hasn't produced the same numbers as Zeke. He's not quite as elite and dynamic as Zeke is. So obviously Josh Jacobs is a great talent still, but he's just not a PPR play for me. So this actually kind of flips the script. If you're in a PPR format, I would sell high on Josh Jacobs and look for a more higher upside player at running back for your team. But in standard leagues, I am actually going to buy low on Josh Jacobs. He's been struggling a lot recently. He's been very touchdown dependent because he's had some brutal matchups up front where the front sevens that he's been playing are very good, and they've actually slowed the Raiders' offense down, especially that run game, to almost nothing. So Josh Jacobs, I believe, had 7 carries for 10 yards against the Buccaneers. It was something very underwhelming, and obviously fantasy owners were left with a bitter taste in their mouth. So if you're able to buy low on Josh Jacobs in standard leagues, I'd absolutely do it because that volume is very valuable in standard leagues along with that touchdown upside. So go get Josh Jacobs if you can in standard leagues, but if you're in a PPR league, I would sell Josh Jacobs. This next guy here, DJ Chark, has actually been one of my more disappointing fantasy players that I was super high on coming into this season. DJ Chark was a guy who I thought was a high-end wide receiver too. He had a really great season last year. It got injury-riddled down the stretch, and he wasn't able to produce for teams in the fantasy playoffs because he was dealing with injuries and just wasn't productive because of those injuries that were hindering his performances. But this season, I expected DJ Chark to bounce back and be a high-level wide receiver 2 producer. And DJ Chark just hasn't been consistent. He's been all over the map. He's had those games where he flashes that elite potential that he has, that elite athleticism, versatility, and size that he has working for him. But overall, the Jags just haven't been able to keep a consistent offense. So Gardner Minshew, unfortunately, was looking at almost getting benched for Mike Glennon last week. And I think that quarterback play has something to do with DJ Chark's inability to produce the numbers we were expecting this season. But overall, I still believe in DJ Chark. I think that moving forward, after a couple of not-so-nice games for Chark, I think that he has the opportunity to be bought for very cheap in fantasy. And the Jags flat out just don't have a good defense. They give up points. They've got some really nice young pieces, but they're just not ready to ball out yet, and they still give up points. The Jags are often trailing in their football games, so they have to throw to catch up, and DJ Chark is a very nice talent, so I think that DJ Chark has some really nice upside moving forward if he's able to get the ball in his hands. Right now, my favorite quarterback to buy low on is Ben Roethlisberger for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Big Ben is an elite talent at quarterback. He's a very great thrower of the football. And recently, Big Ben has been having some issues. Overall, he's been very good since coming back from that Tommy John surgery. I actually didn't expect Big Ben to be this good. I thought he would probably come back washed up because that's a huge surgery for a quarterback to have. But Ben's actually came back very effectively and shown that he can still get the football down the field. Ben Roethlisberger has showed that he can still produce those nice fantasy numbers that we're looking for out of our starting quarterback. But just one thing has been holding Ben back so far this season. Ben's been throwing too many picks. His turnover count is too high, and I think that that is the main thing holding back his production. He's got so many weapons on that offense. James Conner, JuJu Smith-Schuster, Chase Claypool, Deontay Johnson is a stud. He has so many guys to throw the football to. He just has to bring the turnover count down a little bit because he's been so efficient when he hasn't been turning the football over. If he can just cut the pick count down a little bit, Big Ben is getting an extra 2 to 4 points per game, and you're looking at a quarterback who has starting level value in your fantasy lineups that you can probably get off the waiver wire in some leagues. Obviously, in more competitive leagues, Big Ben is going to be a guy who is probably rostered everywhere, but he's probably a backup quarterback. So Ben Roethlisberger, I would definitely go trade for him if you're a team suffering still from quarterback injuries, bye weeks, and whatnot. So Big Ben, definitely a guy I like going forward this season. And even you might be able to wait a week on him. He's got Baltimore this week. That might be a tough matchup. The Steelers' offense might struggle a bit more, and it might even increase the case and probability that you are able to trade for him on the open market. All right, into my second segment of this video, I've got my sell-high candidates, and a guy I've been preaching for weeks. I'm going to continue to say it over and over again, is Todd Gurley, the Atlanta Falcons running back. He actually just cost his team the game last week, not to the distaste of fantasy owners, because he scored a touchdown that he probably should have just sat down at the 1-yard line on, and they ended up giving Detroit enough time to come back and win the football game. But nonetheless, Todd Gurley is a guy who, in leagues other than standard formats, I am definitely selling on this season. Todd Gurley is a guy who I think has touchdown dependency, and he's got some brutal games coming up on the schedule, particularly those in-division games that he's got against the Panthers, the Saints, and the Buccaneers. Those are going to be awful games for the Falcons, and they're really going to struggle. So you don't want anything to do with Todd Gurley in those performances. You need to get off of him now while you still can, because his schedule down the stretch here is just very difficult. And Todd Gurley is a guy who has limited passing game involvement as well. There's going to be games when Todd doesn't get in the end zone, and when the Falcons are trailing big, they don't tend to throw the football to their running backs, because everywhere else on the field, they're very talented at these skill positions. So Todd Gurley is not very involved there, and you're not going to want to deal with the ugly numbers that he puts up in your lineups when that stuff happens. Ceedee Lamb's another guy I'm selling high on the rest of the stretch here of the season. I think that the quarterback play has been a significant issue for the Cowboys, and it will continue to be the story of the team going forward this year. I think that once Dak Prescott went down, once we saw that Andy Dalton is not competent anymore, and then once he got hurt and a 7th-round draft pick came in, I think that that's kind of the point when we knew it was over for Dallas wide receivers. I think that the Cowboys still technically have to throw the football in order to stay in games, but can you really trust an inexperienced quarterback who's not the most talented guy in the world to distribute the ball effectively? I'm going to lean on the side of no, and that means that Ceedee Lamb is a guy who I'm moving off of in fantasy the rest of the year. Right behind Ceedee Lamb on my sell high list is Amari Cooper, his teammate, for the exact same reasons. Amari Cooper is a fantastic player, very talented wide receiver, and probably one of the better guys in the league, but this Dallas offense is just falling apart before our eyes. I laid out my plan of how they could try and get things back on track earlier in today's episode and in yesterday's episode, when I suggested that they actually go out and sign Colin Kaepernick so they have somewhat of a competent starter back there. But for the time being, the Cowboys don't really look to have a hope offensively, and I think that without a very heavy running attack, the Dallas offense is going to be very irrelevant. And I think that for the wide receivers, it's just a tough sell to really expect much out of them with an inexperienced quarterback and an untalented guy. So Amari Cooper has to be on my sell list this week. If you guys can get any value out of him, I would do so and move forward with your teams. I touched on this topic a bit as well in my video yesterday, where I mentioned Odell Beckham Jr., and I talked a little bit about the Cleveland Browns passing game and their pass catchers in particular, and how I don't see much fantasy value for them going forward this season. Jarvis Landry in particular is obviously the beneficiary of the Odell Beckham Jr. injury. Obviously they're best friends, and so they never would wish an injury upon each other. But in terms of targets and the looks that they're going to be getting per game, Jarvis Landry's volume is obviously going to go up a little bit now that Odell is not in the mix due to that ACL injury. So, but my main takeaway here is that the Browns are a run-first football team. They are not looking to air the ball out down the field and sling the rock a bunch of times. They want to control the time of possession. They want to run the football, and they want to win the line of scrimmage. So that means that throwing to their wideouts is not their primary focus. This team doesn't want to put the ball in Baker Mayfield's hands 30 times a game. They're looking to minimize that role for him. He's more of a game manager than a game changer for the Browns. So Jarvis Landry, as a result, is not a guy I'm super happy about in fantasy this season. I think that it's fair to be lower on him, just considering the fact that the Browns' passing volume is not what a lot of people expected it to be with all those weapons they have there. If you can find someone who thinks that Jarvis Landry is going to be a star now, all of a sudden that Odell Beckham Jr. is not in that lineup, or if you can trade him away for another low-end wide receiver too or flex player, I would do so. I mean, Jarvis Landry has a somewhat reasonably safe floor. I think there's a lot of trades you could take with the potential for higher upside players with very minimal risk. By giving up Jarvis Landry, you're not really giving up a whole lot. So it's worth a shot. If you guys can find a trade for Landry, I would do so. And I think that you guys could maybe find a solid piece for your lineups the rest of the year. I've been loving myself some Gronk the last 2 weeks. He has been fantastic, and I have loved starting Gronk the past 2 weeks. But I think it's time to take a step back here and take a look at the bigger picture. The Tampa Bay offense is about to have Antonio Brown injected into the lineup, and I think what that means is a lot less targets for everyone else in that offense, besides probably Chris Godwin. There is so many mouths to feed in Tampa. Gronk is starting to look like himself again, but I think that as we see the amount of weapons in that offense go up and up, the amount of targets and volume that everyone can get is going to come down because there's just so many guys to get the football there. And I think that Gronkowski takes a bit of a dip as well. He's been having some nice volume the last couple weeks, and he's been getting some valuable targets in the red zone. But Gronk, I think realistically, is going to come back down to earth. I don't think he's going to be terrible. I think that he still has some value, but right now he's producing like a top 5 tight end, at least in terms of the last couple weeks since he's been healthy. But I think that if you guys can find someone who's on the Gronk hype train, I would move off of him because this year more than ever, tight ends are replaceable in fantasy football, and I think that if you guys can find a trade where you get some value in return for Gronk, it's definitely a thing you guys should look to do. This next player is a bit of an interesting situation, and that is Melvin Gordon for the Denver Broncos. Melvin Gordon had two lost fumbles in the game where they were taken down by the Kansas City Chiefs. And for a football coach, one thing you hate more than almost anything else is fumbles, turning the football over, being sloppy, and losing the possession of the ball. And when a guy does it twice in, let alone a season, but twice in 1 week and loses both of them, you're going to get less touches. You're not getting the football as much. So I think that Melvin Gordon this week sees his volume taken down slightly. Now, the thing that makes this very interesting is that Phillip Lindsay is actually expected to miss this week's game. So will the Broncos actually trust Royce Freeman to take those carries over for him? I don't know, but in terms of the short leash I think Gordon's going to be on, I think he's a guy you might want to move off of here for coaching situational purposes, more so than fantasy purposes. Obviously, he's got the Chargers front that he has to deal with. The Chiefs have been very stout, and obviously we just saw him have a not-so-hot game against them because they are a very productive defense as well. But Melvin Gordon's a guy I'm not super high on the rest of the season. He's a solid RB2, but he doesn't have too much upside anymore. And I think that with Phillip Lindsay returning, if his fumble struggles continue, I think that he's a guy that you might want to move off of. Another guy I'd entertain trading in fantasy football this week is Ronald Jones of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Ronald Jones, in the time that Leonard Fournette was out, was an absolutely fantastic fantasy player. He produced very great numbers, and he honestly looked like a borderline RB1. He was putting up very consistent numbers. He was getting high volume. But now that Leonard Fournette is in the backfield again, they're looking to, they're actually splitting carries right down the middle, to be honest. The numbers are almost 50-50 in favor of Jones and Fournette. Both of them are bigger backs, so they get goal line carries. Both of them get involved slightly in the passing game. But I think that Ronald Jones moving forward with Fournette in the backfield when he's healthy is more of an RB2 and less of an RB1. So if you guys were expecting that RB1 production out of Ronald Jones the rest of the season, I would look to move off of him because he's probably not the guy who's going to give you those numbers anymore. I think he's still a safe RB2 floor player. He's got a very nice floor. He's a safe player, but I think that the ceiling now with Leonard Fournette in the backfield with him has been taken down a little bit as well. My next style high player is James Robinson for the Jacksonville Jaguars, and there's probably some of you guys looking at the screen right now wondering why the heck are you saying I should trade James Robinson after he's been so productive for my team this season. He's been very elite. He's a certified RB1 at this point in the season. He's actually producing very solid numbers. He's got a high ceiling and a safe floor. And James Robinson's been fantastic to this point. But the main reason I'm telling you guys to move off of Robinson this week is simply because the Jacksonville Jaguars are not a dependable football team. Don't get me wrong, James Robinson's been fantastic this season, but the team goes as James Robinson does. And there's been some ugly performances from Robinson. That he's actually been bailed out by a garbage time touchdown. And obviously, while that still counts for fantasy football, that's not very dependable in the real NFL. And I think that there might be a time when in garbage time, James Robinson isn't able to score against a tougher matchup. And those not so great fantasy football numbers really come back to bite you in games when it really counts. James Robinson has a relatively difficult schedule during the weeks 14, 15, and 16 fantasy football playoffs. This is one reason why I'm a little bit lower on Robinson than I otherwise would have been. In yesterday's video, I actually talked about how James Robinson had fully earned my trust, but that doesn't take away the fact that opposing defenses are still really good, and fronts like the Ravens and whatnot, who are one of the teams on his schedule, can completely shut a player down. So James Robinson is a great player for fantasy this season, but I think that if you guys can look to get a higher upside RB1, I would trade him straight up for Miles Sanders if I'm being completely honest. Miles Sanders has a much lighter playoff schedule for the fantasy playoffs, and he's also got that high upside as well that you look for in an RB1. So I think that there's some opportunity to be looked for here with James Robinson. I think he's definitely a solid player against good matchups, but in weeks when you need him to produce against high-level defenses, I don't think that the Jags are the way to go, and thus I think you guys should move off of Robinson if you have the chance. This next player is more of just a sell, not even a sell high. JuJu Smith-Schuster has not been good this season. Obviously, players were picking him to be a top wide receiver in their fantasy lineups, but he's clearly not produced to that level. Chase Claypool and Deontay Johnson have been better, and they're on the same team as Smith-Schuster, so JuJu Smith-Schuster finally had a 9-catch game. I think he had 80 yards, no scores. So it was kind of an average day, but he got back on track a little bit. JuJu has lost his must-start label in fantasy football this year just because he hasn't been productive to the standard that we have set for him. So just look to trade JuJu Smith-Schuster. Honestly, you're not going to get a lot back in return for the guy, but I think that at this point in the year, he's not really a dependable option. I think that now that he had one solid week, you look for a potential trade partner and look to move off of him for the rest of the year. Another guy I've been preaching on my sell high lists the last few weeks is Clyde Edwards-Helaire, and the time is not up yet. You can still move off of Clyde Edwards. Le'Veon Bell did not really get involved too much in the Chiefs offense this past week against the Broncos, but I thought the thing that was very concerning to me was that in a game when the Chiefs actually completely blew out the Broncos, it was really never a game. Clyde Edwards only had 8 carries and a few receptions to tag along to that, while Le'Veon Bell had 6 carries. So very similar to that 60 to 40% snap and touch count percentage I was expecting. Clyde obviously getting the nudge a little bit over Bell, but these guys are both going to be very much involved in the offense, and Bell is clearly going to affect Clyde Edwards' fantasy value. Clyde got in the end zone, which really helped his lack of volume this week, but I think that the production for Clyde Edwards-Helaire is going to be down the remainder of the season, and obviously you want your fantasy players to be playing their best football at the end of the year and not at the start of the season, which is what the case looks to be like with Clyde this season. So CEH is a guy I would still continue to look to trade off of moving forward in this season. I think that this is probably the last week where you really have a nice shot to move off of him. I think that going forward, we're going to start to see Bell more and more in that offense, and once that happens, Clyde's value is going to go down, and it's going to be increasingly harder to trade off of Clyde and get some valuable assets in return. The last guy I want to talk about in this week's trade episode is Chase Edmonds, the Cardinals' new starting running back for the next couple games here. The Cardinals are on bye week this week, and their starting running back, Kenyon Drake, was carted off the field on Sunday Night Football against the Seahawks. He had a partial ligament tear in his ankle, so like I said, expected to miss a few weeks. So with the bye week this week for the Cardinals, that means that there will be roughly 2 games after that, maybe 3, where Chase Edmonds has the opportunity to start, and he's been highly productive when given that workload and the potential to touch the football. So Chase Edmonds is definitely a guy I love in fantasy lineups the next 2 to 3 games for the Cardinals, but after that, his value is going to be minimized again. He's going to be a very high-level producer in those 2 games, but I think that you guys might be able to milk something out of the trade market for him while he is the starter. The key with Edmonds, though, is to make sure you trade him now and not wait a week or 2, because the longer you wait with these type of guys who are fill-ins and high-level handcuff players, the lesser their value is at the time that you try to trade them. So as much and as tempting as it may be to try and hang on to Edmonds for a couple games and then move him off, I think that it's more valuable to your team to try and get a long-term starter opposed to a few-week guy who can provide fantasy value for your lineups. With that being said, that will conclude my Week 8 Fantasy Football Trade Targets video. Those were my buy low and sell high candidates for this week's NFL action. If you guys enjoyed the video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. drop down any comments and questions you guys have in the comment section down below, and I'll be sure to get to that. Thank you guys so much for being a part of the channel. I really appreciate all your guys' support, and I really look forward to watching this channel continue to grow and develop on YouTube. So, again, thank you guys so much, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.